As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sisters, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sisters, let's go down, down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, brothers, let's go down, come on down. Come on, brothers, let's go down, down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Show me the way. Oh, sinners, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sinners, let's go down, down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown? Show me the way. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way.
Amen. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Michelle. For our scripture passage this morning, I'm going to be reading from the Old Testament. I'll be reading from the book of 1 Samuel. For those of you who want to follow along in your Bibles, I'll be reading from the 20th chapter and verses 24 to 34. And just listen to this, and I'm going to go back and give you some context in a few minutes. But just listen to this story. So David hid himself in the field. When the new moon came, the king sat to the feast to eat. The king sat upon his seat, as at other times, upon the seat by the wall. Jonathan stood, while Abner sat by Saul's side. But David's place was empty. Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, something has befallen him. He is not clean? Surely he is not clean. But on the second day, the day after the new moon, David's place was empty. And Saul said to his son Jonathan, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to the feast, either yesterday or today?" Jonathan answered Saul, "David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, 'Let me go, for our family is holding a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there.' So now, if I have found favor in your sight, let me get away and see my brothers, for this is the reason he has not come to the king's table." Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. He said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse over your own shame, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon this earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." Then Jonathan answered his father Saul, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul threw his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that it was the decision of his father to put David to death. Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food on the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David and because his father had disgraced him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, as Lynn pointed out, We've got some additional props up here on the stage today. We got a tent, lantern, some other gadgets, a campfire we'll be adding to the scene as we go through the month. But doing a new sermon series this month with, yes, as you guessed, of course, a camping theme. I grew up going camping. That was a part of my upbringing. At first, when I was a young child, we used to go to state parks. We used to do car camping. We'd get out tents just like this one. In fact, I think we fit 5 of us in a tent like this for a little while. That was not terribly fun. But we did a lot of those family trips to nearby state parks. When I got a little bit older, around the age of 9 or 10, my dad said, okay, you can start to carry stuff now. And so let's go take a more intense camping trip. And so we would go to the BWCA, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that part of the country, that's up in northern Minnesota on the Canadian border. And it's all wilderness land up there. And one of the great things about it is there are no cell phone towers. You rarely ever see an airplane fly overhead. It's completely silent of all human kinds of noises, and you can't bring any motors up there. So no motorboats, no four-wheelers. All you can do is drive your vehicle into a gravel lot on the edge of the boundary and then put your canoe in the water and start paddling in. You get really kind of crude maps that show with a red dot approximately where campsites are. And when you get to the campsite, there's a little fire grate and a latrine out in the woods. And so it's very remote. It's kind of rugged camping. And when you get to the end of the lake, you put your canoe up on your shoulders, you put your pack on, and you portage through the woods until you get to the next lake or stream and put in there, go again to the next one. And so within a few hours' time, you could be somewhere where you won't see anyone for a whole week. And that's part of the allure for some of us who really have enjoyed that time in the wilderness. Others of you are thinking, that's madness. I would never do that. And that's fine. But I used to do that with my dad. And then we would do it with his friend and his son, and then later on my uncle and my cousin. So this was an annual tradition where we would do this once, and maybe we even did it twice a year at a couple of different times. And this is a part of what we did. And when you would camp that often, you would start to pick up on certain things that were good ideas or bad ideas and certain practices and patterns that you picked up on. For example, one of the things we found out early on, no matter how tired you are at the end of the day and after dinner, and even if it's dark, you still must walk way back into the woods, find a tall tree with a branch growing at 90 degrees, hurl a rock tied to a rope over it, and pull your food pack up there for the night. Because if you're tired and you decide that you want to stash it under a rock or somewhere else under a log that you think it won't be found, the bear will find it. The bear will find it. And there's nothing quite as mood dampening on a camping trip as all your food being eaten or ransacked by a bear. That happened once. Learned that lesson. Another thing that we learned, and this is maybe a little bit crude for Sunday morning, but you'll understand. You're in your tent. You wake up in the middle of the night. Nature calls. We found out that it is always worth it to get up, go outside the tent, and take care of business, and then crawl back into that sleeping bag and go back to bed, instead of saying, I'm just going to wait till dawn, which just means that you'll wake up every 15 minutes for the rest of the night. Always worth it. And so these little things that we learned became what in our family we began to call the laws of the woods. The laws of the woods. So each week in the month of June, I'm going to share a law of the woods brought to you from the Christiansen family. And these will be life lessons for you and lessons for camping and life that you will, I'm sure, cling to and cherish for all of your days. So today's lesson for a law of the woods is about wet boots. See, the thing that happens when you are not camping in an RV is that when you go canoe camping, and if you were riding at the front of the canoe, as I always was, as the smaller of the two people growing up, what would happen is you'd run the canoe up on the shore. Now, sometimes it's not a sandy beach. In fact, I can only recall one campsite that ever was. Usually it's a rock outcropping or a bog or maybe even knee-deep water. But that's the place that you're going to have to get the canoe out of the water. And so I would try early on to get myself up by the front of the canoe and then sort of do one of these huge leg stretches and put my toe on the shore and then try to get up onto the land without getting my boots wet. The problem with that is that nearly every time I did that, I would shake the canoe so violently that we would risk tipping over the whole canoe, wetting down all of our clothes, turning all of our food to gravy, and upsetting mightily my father in the back of the canoe. So what I found out was, it's just easier if you go ahead and put your foot in the water. It's going to be wet socks and wet boots for the rest of the trip, but it is better than capsizing everything that you brought on the camping trip. And so after I've done this for a few years, I just started going in right as soon as we got out of the car. Let's just go ahead and get those feet wet. I'm just going to stand up to my knees and be done with it, and now I have nothing to fear. So these boots have been turned upside down and dried out for months at a time after some of those trips. So it's sometimes good to get your feet wet. And what that translates to is that sometimes it's worth a small sacrifice in order to get at a much more important thing. Now, in today's story in the Bible, you heard about a sacrifice from a guy named Jonathan. And for those of you who it's been a while since you've heard this story, or maybe this is unfamiliar to you, here's the background on this. So the people of Israel, they are asking God for a king because they said, look at all of our neighbors, all of our neighboring nations, they have kings. We don't have a king yet. We want our own king. We want to be like them. We want to have official status in this place. And throughout time, God has sent prophets who said, no, you don't need kings. You've got God. God is enough. God has provided for you since the beginning. You don't need a king to oversee your people. And they said, but we really want a king. We really want a king. And so finally, God relents. And God appoints the first king, and his name is Saul. And everything's going well for Saul at first, until not too long after Saul's been king, God gives directions to anoint a small shepherd boy named David as the next king. He's the king waiting on deck to be king after Saul has died. David, it's okay at first. David's just this tiny little boy. He's humble. I mean, maybe he'll grow up to be something, but he's no threat. But then David and the whole Goliath thing happens, and David begins to receive quite a bit of notoriety for it. And so now all of a sudden, David's a household name in Israel. Yes, and did you hear he's anointed to be our next king? Well, this just makes Saul, the current king, feel quite uneasy about the circumstances. And what begins is an uneasiness, moves into a fear, which then moves into an anxiety, and ultimately leads to full-blown paranoia. So at the point of today's story, you have David, who is now a young man. He's grown up under Saul's tutelage. He has been an instrumentalist who's been playing the harp for King Saul, and Saul originally was interested in this, took a liking to David and sort of took him under his wing, but now it's turned to jealousy, fear, and paranoia. Saul has a boy of his own who's about David's age. His name is Jonathan. And it's got to be a strange thing to grow up as the son of a king, especially the son of Israel's first king. And so Jonathan has, in many ways, I'm sure, an atypical life. And so this other boy who's growing up with this atypical life, the king-to-be someday, becomes his best friend. And Jonathan and David are like this, like as tight of a bond of friendship as you could ever get. They're inseparable. They have a deep admiration and love for each other. And they are tight. But as Saul gets more and more uncomfortable with David's presence, he begins to lose it. He loses his grip on reality. Now, David has never done anything terribly threatening. David's not conspired against the king. He has not come up with an assassination plot. He is just patiently waiting because he knows in God's time this will all work itself out. Saul doesn't see it that way. And the closer that David gets to being of age to be the king, the more Saul is enraged and crazy. He's gone mad. So he conspires to kill David. And he wants to bring his son Jonathan in on this plot because he knows that Jonathan is like the bait that will bring David close enough that he can kill him. And so they normally eat dinner together, and it's the first day of the month, and so there's going to be a big feast prepared. And so that's where we pick up in today's story. And Saul says, I'm going to have a feast and everybody should show up. And so he's got a spot for his son Jonathan and he's got a spot for David. David doesn't come to the feast that night. Saul's not too worried about it because he says, well, he's probably just unclean. And he means, ritually unclean. You couldn't come and dine with the king if you had been around a dead thing, or if you'd killed an animal, or if you had had any blood on your body or anything like that, or a host of other reasons why it would cause somebody to be ritually unclean. So he doesn't think anything of it. The second night, however, he notices an empty seat at the table where David should be seated. He says to Jonathan, so where is David? Except he doesn't say that. He says, where is the son of Jesse? Because his rage is so strong now, he can't even say his name. And Jonathan makes up something. He says, well, I told him that he could go back and visit his family. He asked special permission. He wanted to go be with his brothers to have the feast tonight. And I told him that it was okay to go back to Bethlehem and do that. And Saul is livid. He is furious. Because he knows that Jonathan has cooked up something with David to protect David. And in fact, they have. They came up with a plan because they both knew that Saul had it in for David. And so the plan was Jonathan would go out into a field and David would be hidden in that field. And Jonathan would shoot an arrow. And if it went to a particular distance, that meant it was safe for David to come home. But if it went short of that distance, it meant you better stay away. So the first night he goes and shoots it after he misses the meal, no sweat. The second time he shoots the arrow, he says, it's real bad. So bad was it that you heard some of the terrible things that Saul said to his son. He curses him, says awful things about his wife and Jonathan's mother. And then when Jonathan lies to him, Saul picks up a spear, which apparently he has while he's eating dinner, and he hucks it at him, and it misses. And as you might imagine, this sort of changes the father-son dynamic going forward. You don't get to walk away from a spear-throwing incident at the dinner table. But Jonathan is deeply grieved by what's happened. In that moment, he had to make a terrible decision. He had to sacrifice one relationship in order to preserve another. He had to break with one kind of thing and make a sacrifice in order to save someone else's life. We were talking about this in our worship planning meeting the other day. And Stephen Ingram brought up a great point. He said, there's lots of stories of sacrifice in the Bible, but most of us don't ever feel like we're probably going to be asked to die on a cross. Most of us are never going to be put into the position of Abraham and his son Isaac. Most of us have never even slaughtered an animal, much less brought it forward to be a sacrifice. But this is the kind of sacrifice in this story that we can understand. Making a sacrifice for the good of the whole is something that we can wrap our brains around. And I would certainly venture to guess that every one of you at some point or another in your life has had to make a sacrifice that caused some sort of pain to you. It might have been a sacrificing some kind of opportunity for the good of something else. It might have been sacrificing something that was important or dear to you for the benefit of your family or for somebody else's well-being. It may be that you actually had a situation that was similar to that of Jonathan and Saul, where you had to sacrifice one relationship for another, or as painful as this one was, sacrificing something that had to do with your family of origin for someone else. These are deeply complicated, conflicted kind of moments. that we will all experience at one time or another, and we just have to know when push comes to shove, am I going to do it? And normally it's pretty clear to us which is the right thing to do, isn't it? I mean, in those situations, it's usually easy for us to say, this is the right thing. But it's also hard to do it because we know that it's going to come at a cost. There will be a price to pay for that. It will be really hard. It's difficult to do. That's why it's a sacrifice. In just a little bit, we'll be sharing communion. Communion, of course, is, I think, the greatest example of sacrifice that we find in the Bible. Because Jesus is laying out very clearly exactly what the crucifixion is going to mean. Breaking the bread, this is my body given for you, take and eat this. This is my blood poured out for you. It's pretty clear. Strong symbolism, he's not mincing words. You know, the story of the Last Supper, as I've mentioned a couple times already this spring, is set to take place, or reportedly took place in this room called the Upper Room, or that's at least how it was described, an upper room area. And like most things in the Holy Land, there is a place that tradition holds. This is the place where that took place. For those of you who will be going on the Holy Land trip that we're doing next June, you will probably be able to see this very spot. It's the place where the Last Supper took place. It's the place where the disciples gathered after the resurrection, and it's the place where reportedly Pentecost took place. And it's a nondescript room. I got to go in there a few years ago. It's a room, it's a little smaller than this. It's probably about half the size of this worship center. It's got high domed ceilings. It's whitewashed ceilings, whitewashed walls. It looks old, but kind of nondescript, kind of not special, kind of like the kind of place that Jesus would choose to do something significant. The exception to that is over in one of the corners, near the door, is this strange sculpture. It's like it's been carved into the wall, or somebody carved this thing and then attached it to the wall. And as I went over to look at it, because your eye is drawn to it because there's nothing else in this room. And you go over and you look at it, and it is a bird sculpture. So naturally, I went to our guide and I said, "What's with that?" And she looks at me as though I'm a fool and says, "Well, it's a pelican." Yeah, but why is there a pelican on the wall is what I really wanted to know. Oh, she said, well, let me tell you. Do you not know about the legend of the pelican? No, I do not know about the legend of the pelican. I said, here's the thing. The pelican, supposedly, is a bird that the mother pelican, when feeding her young, if she ever runs out of food, and the children begin to starve, she will peck the flesh of her own breast and feed her children to keep them alive, sacrificing herself for her children's future. Now I get why there's a pelican in that place. Of all places, on the wall in that room. We might not be called to give of our flesh. It's unlikely that we will be martyrs. It's unlikely that we will be ever called to do something as horrific as what Abraham was prepared to do to his son. It's unlikely that we will ever give an animal sacrifice if you maintain a relationship with Jesus. But what is likely is that you will face an important moment in your life, a crossroads moment where you will say, I have to make this sacrifice for the good of something else. And if it's a relationship, or if it's something like Jesus did, it will take the form of a relationship. I will have to give this to save my marriage. I will have to give this to reconcile with that person with whom I have been at odds. I will have to give away this, take on that, move to here, sell off that, give up this in order to have the kind of future that I know Christ is leading me to have. And it's not easy. And it will be exchanged for our time, our treasure, our pride, our desire to feel in control. All of these things at times will be sacrificed for the greater good. We're going to have to get our boots wet to do what we're called to do. And sometimes, in fact, I would argue that it's essential that in order to continue to grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ, it is going to continue to take sacrifice on our part too. There are things that Jesus will call us to do as his followers, as his disciples, that will mean setting aside something or sacrificing something else, because that's what it means to be a true follower and disciple of his. But the good news is, and the thing that we always need to keep sight of, is that first, Jesus sacrificed everything for that future relationship with us. And we're here today because he initiated the first move, the first step, in showing us what true sacrifice is really about.
Thanks again for being here with us for worship. We're glad that you joined us for S3. If you'd like to know more about the church, discipleship opportunities, or ways that you can serve, be sure to click on one of the links below. Also, if you're interested in supporting the church beyond your prayers and your presence, we hope that you'll consider giving financially as well, and you can find that link on our page as well. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.